I'm Nick Timmerman. I'm a PhD student in the Department of History and a part of this project. And I get the, joy and pleasure of trying to have a discussion here and keep us within a time frame. So this is going to be fun. We have about 40 minutes, and I'm going to kind of prime the panel with a couple questions, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the floor, to the community, to ask any one of them. But before we get started, I'll introduce each one of them. And I'm kind of leaning towards just letting Mr. Chris Taylor just sing for us. I really enjoyed that. So, I mean, we'll start here. This is Dr. Stephanie Rolfe. She's an assistant professor at Millsaps College down in Jackson. So we thank her for coming up from Jackson, Mississippi tonight and being with us. She's also a graduate of the history department. She got her PhD here at Mississippi State, so that's kind of exciting. We have Dr. Shirley Henshaw, who is also an associate professor in the Department of English here at Mississippi State University. She has her PhD from the University of Mississippi. Next to her is Dr. Michael Williams, who also has his PhD from the University of Mississippi, and a lot of other titles, which I'll give him. The Dean of the Division of Social Sciences, the Benny Gordon Thompson Endowed Chair in the Social Sciences, and Associate Professor of History at Tougaloo College, and he also serves as an adjunct professor in the Department of History at Mississippi State. That's a lot to say. But, and then finally, and not least, Mr. Chris Taylor, who is the local NAACP president, and also with Dr. Henshaw, a participant in this, as we saw already. So we've already heard some of their things, but I'm going to start off with a question for Dr. Michael Williams, and I'll hand the microphone off to him when I'm asked this question. Can you give us a sense of comparative perspective? How does this compare to other movements within the state of Mississippi?
Chair, first of all, you asked me that question, but in the interest of time. No, but seriously, I want to start by saying good evening to each and every one of you. Come on now, good evening. Good evening. All right, there we go. All right, that's a very important question when you talk about comparative. With Starkville, and even though we've now, even with the interviews that we've seen, kind of think that Starkville is a little bit different. But it's really not. When you start thinking about in terms of how African Americans are feeling within the city of Starkville. It's the same as they feel all over the state of Mississippi. African Americans understand full well the level of oppression that they're under. The objective then becomes how do we deal with that kind of oppression? In that regard, you have the same thing going on in Jackson, you have the same thing going on in Mount Bayou, you have the same thing going on in Biloxi, you have the same thing going on in Ruleville, you have the same things going on in Indianola. You have those same kinds of ideals. And so from that perspective, it's not that much different. When you start looking at the actual different aspects of it in terms of African Americans working concertedly to end that oppression, then you start to see those things we talked about earlier, that episodic, and even that's simple. But that's how the movement starts. It's when individuals begin to say we've had enough, and now we want to change that. That's how you get the movement going. And so when we start talking about how does that work overall, that is, in essence, the movement. When you start looking at civil rights struggle, and I see a lot of the elders here who are participating in that, when you start looking at civil rights struggle, it is the kind of forward thinking in which people say, now it's time for change. You saw that in Starkville. All right, so when you start talking about the comparative part, that's how I look at it in terms of that. It's the similar movement, it's the same kinds of ideas, people understand what they are, and then they move forward to change those things.
Thank you for that response. Next question, this one's going to be for Dr. Stephanie Rolfe. How does the white backlash elsewhere in the state compare to what we're seeing in Starkville?
Good evening. Good evening. I'm so happy to be here, and congratulations for the successful work. It's a pleasure for me to see this as a premiere event. Historians never get to go to premieres. So I'm happy to be here. I'm also humbled as the spokesperson for white resistance. So unfortunately that voice is represented a little bit here. A lot of things are on my mind, and there were a lot of notes that I took in watching those interviews. Thinking about the white backlash, my familiarity with that is in the form of the Citizens Council, which was the most successful, persistent, organized institution against desegregation until it disbanded around 1987, 1988, arguably. Horace Harned, who is a native of Starkville and has a building here named after him, I believe, served as president of the Association of Citizens Council of Mississippi for a while. And when he was interviewed in the 1980s, he was fairly unreformed about the Citizens Council work, although he had changed his narrative about it a little. So when asked what he thought it was that they were doing, he said they were protecting conservative values, and that it really wasn't about race, that it was about maintaining what had been traditional institutions, protecting their families, that sort of thing. I've seen that echoed in other profiles that have been done on Citizens Council members, especially as the organization was disbanding in the 1980s. Journalists were particularly curious about what these guys thought about what they had done. Looking back on it, over 40 years of organization and resistance, long after sweeping civil rights legislation had been passed, these guys were still active on some level, especially in publication. And so this reminds me, thinking about Horace Harned and his identification with conservatism, and thinking about some of those late-term journalistic profiles. Bill Simmons, who some of you might be familiar with, he was probably the most recognizable Citizens Council administrator and the most tireless. When he was interviewed about what he thought that they had done and what he thought the legacy was, he pointed to the private school movement. And in that way, he considered the Citizens Council movement's work done by the time he was interviewed in 1987. That there was really no reason for the council to stay together because their work was finished and they had been successful. So when I think about organized resistance, a lot of times when we think about the Citizens Council and the institutions that they allied with to, at the very least, delay implementation of the federal mandates, I think about his reflections 40 years later and this remembrance that somehow it was successful. I think it forces us to contend with white flight and the permanent footprints of that, what that left behind, and the fact that in many ways that was successful. Many white moderates, as school desegregation began to take place throughout the state, as it was actually applied long after Brown versus Board of Education, began to sympathize more with the Citizens Council message when they realized that this was actually happening. So white moderates who had tried to distance themselves from the Citizens Council and its legacy actually were the first to enroll their kids in these private schools. Capturing that moderate white middle class in the Citizens Council school movement, to me, says a lot about how invisible that legacy has become, especially in the state of Mississippi, which is rife with private schools, especially in areas that are predominantly black. So resistance takes many forms, but as I'm hearing them talk about desegregation and the way in which that crystallized in the way that it did, I also see white resistance reconverging later than you would think it does. In the late 1960s, early 1970s, it becomes more popular. It's just not as associated clearly with the Citizens Council. It does begin to be called conservatism. So there are a lot of other factors that go into this, but it's not my panel, so I'm going to pass this back to Nick.
Thank you. Dr. Henshaw, why do you think it took longer in Starkville to integrate and to organize during this time?
Good evening.
Good evening.
And I'd just like to pay obeisance to one of my mentors, Mrs. Early Fleming. Would you raise your hand? She taught me French, and I want you to know, Ms. Fleming, that in 2010, when I presented a paper in Paris at a Toni Morrison conference, I was able to get around Paris using some of the French I learned. Well, let me just add here that I left Starkville in 1965. Okay, so some of the experiences that some of the panelists had who were younger than I and who were still here. And let me say why I left Starkville in 1965. Dr. Connor, who was the only black doctor in town and who was a friend of my parents, I'm the 8th of 9 children. And we grew up literally right across the road from Mississippi State University. So all 9 of us were looking over on the campus and couldn't attend school there. It was tacit in our family that once you finish school, you go to college. So at one time, all 9 of us were in 9 different states. We all went to college. Well, Dr. Connor asked my parents for me to be the one to desegregate Mississippi State. I was the valedictorian of the class, and I was one of the first National Achievement Scholars. The National Achievement Scholarships, I don't know if people are familiar with them, they came about as a result of a bill by Representative Adam Clayton Powell Jr. from New York. It was the largest education bill in history that established the National Achievement Scholarships, and I was only a recipient from Starkville. So it was felt by many of the African American leaders that, okay, I would be a good candidate. But my parents were not to have it. They did not want me in that hostile environment. And so I left Starkville. And when I returned to Mississippi State, to Starkville 40 years later, when I went up for promotion and tenure, I put in my dossier that I could go to any college and university anywhere in the United States, except the one across the road from me. So I went to Tougaloo College, and then to Brown University, and then to Temple University, and then returned to Mississippi later. I can't speak to, why the movement evolved the way that it did, but I can speak to 2 things that made desegregation of Mississippi State different from that at University of Mississippi, if I may. When I talked to some of my older siblings, I learned several things. First of all, Josie, that sheriff you were talking about, he was instrumental in running a number of young African-American men away from Starkville, one of whom was my oldest brother, who was just walking down the street one day, down Main Street. And he said, boy, I'll go upside your head, just like that. Because of the tensions, I think, that were going on in the city, he just found reason. So my parents called my grandparents in Toledo, Ohio, and said, we're sending Junior on the next train. And he's 79 years old. And that's a memory just like it happened yesterday. Those sorts of things happen. But 2 more overarching events were, there was a sheriff later in Starkville named Harpo, who, as sheriffs go in Mississippi and in the Deep South, he was pretty just. He treated African Americans with some amount of dignity. My father knew him. Well, I'm told that at the border of Lowndes and Oktibbeha counties, the Klan, when they heard that now the Dr. Connor's son, who came home that same summer of 1965, Richard Holmes, he was 2 years ahead of me in high school, he came home and he decided to desegregate Mississippi State. And so the homes called the Diversity Center's named for him. Harpo stopped the Klan on the border of Lowndes and Ottawa County. He never let them cross the border. The other national event was that President Johnson threatened to cut off federal funds to Mississippi State if it were not desegregated and without incident. So those are things that you don't hear about when you say that, when you hear that, okay, the desegregation of Mississippi State was not similar to that of the University of Mississippi. Another thing I learned when I returned to Starkville 40 years later was that my friends who lived in several communities, pockets of African American communities, 16th section, Ebenezer, Blackjack, and so on. And many of my friends told me they couldn't walk down their own road because white students from Mississippi State would be throwing bottles and cans at them in their own communities. And so even though on its face it seems as though desegregation was somewhat benign here, it really wasn't. So.
Thank you. Last question before I open this up to the rest of the community for Mr. Taylor. What stands out most in your mind about this time period?
Let me go back a while on the question you said, what took Starkville so long? Well, in the early 60s, Medgar Evers did come to Starkville, and he did talk to Dr. Connor. This is according to Dr. Marcellet's book, Life History of Dr. Douglas Connor. And for some reason, Dr. Connor said back then that Starkville was not ready for the NAACP. I'm not sure the date or the time, but as you get Dr. Connor's book, it's in there. But you don't remember the date. The same thing with the date and time Ottawa County first NAACP started. Well, the only thing that was on Dr. Connor's paper was 1969. So we still don't have the date nor the month, you know. And that's kind of weird, you know, to think back then that the only thing they was right on there was 1969. So another question, he said, what took Starkville so long? Well, Starkville still is in that same mentality, portions of it. We have a VFW, Veterans Foreign War, that has no black members. We have American Legion, Post 240, still don't have no black members. That's the white organizations. Now, we can fight together, we can serve together, but we can't come home, but we can eat together, you know. And the only thing about the VFW, take one member to vote no, and you cannot become a member of the organization. Now, American Legion Post 240 is black. We have white members. So, you know, it's still there. And it shouldn't be. I just wish someone could tell me why. So, what was your question? Sorry. Some of the things that stands out is, as I talked to other people about the marches and stuff, it was some beatings upside the head, but I didn't witness none. Like Mr. Graham said, he had been hit. We have a few other people. The Jefferson twins. In that film earlier, he mentioned Ron Carver. I mean, he mentioned Carver, and he didn't mention Light. Those two white that came into Starkville from up north in California to register people to vote. They lived down on 82 across from Peter Rock Church in a place called Coudon Bottom. The house they lived in didn't have no running water, so they had to live with the Lomax. And this stands out in my mind is they was here earlier this year when Dr. Middleton had them here for the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, right? Voters' Rights Act, I'm sorry. And they were telling their story. I don't remember them, but Frances Lomax, well, Frances Wilson now, she remembered. She was a young girl. She was about 14, and she remembered them. And you know, you have who that Bobby Baldwell say one lived with him and his family. Well, they lived across from us on Long Street. You know, it's kind of weird, and that's the stuff that stands out. Back then, the Derby, that's right there on 82, but most of all, Starkville Cafe up on Main Street. We could not go in the front door. We had to order food from the back. Even though they had black cooks and everything, but, you know, we could not go in the front door. Things have changed, things are better, but, you know, it's the older generation that still holds on to something. You know, that was our family member that was afraid to do anything. During the interview, I was taking the young lady around, and she was talking to some of the educators about what they remember. They said they didn't get involved because, like you said, they're afraid of their jobs. So it was students that did it all, and that's all I got to say.
I just wanted to add, it occurred to me as he was talking, after Brown v. Board, to placate African Americans across the South and particularly here as well. A number of the schools were named after African American principals, such as Henderson High, and it's interesting how the consolidation is taking place now, because during that time there was a consolidation of many of the county schools with the city schools, but it was consolidation of African American schools with African American schools. And so even though there was supposed to be this freedom of choice, this predated freedom of choice, but I'll never forget that we were bused past 3 white schools. We would get on the bus at dawn and not get back home until dusk. And I'm talking elementary school-aged kids all the way up to high school. Let's see, 1st through 6th grade I went to one school, 8th grade I went to another school, 7th grade, 1st through 6th to one school, 7th grade to another school, 8th grade to yet another school, 9th to 12th to another one. All to pass the white schools where my siblings and I were now allowed to go. So it was multifaceted, you know, and as they said, you know, people's jobs were threatened, and you know that was a reality for desegregation everywhere. That if a person, particularly parents, and that's why a lot of the freedom movements were of young people, because they knew that if their parents were out front, they stood to lose their jobs. And I think Dr. Williams also spoke to some of those the reasons.
Because I want to add to that too, because this becomes a really important topic when we start trying to figure out what is going on in terms of the movement and what people are involved in. But Mr. Taylor said earlier in terms of the NAACP coming into Starkville and why it took so long. Mayor Evers did come and talk to Dr. Connor, and Dr. Connor is a key part of what's going on in Starkville. He's a doctor here, but more importantly, he realizes that his responsibility is not only to minister to the body, but also to the soul and also to the mind and also to the rights and privileges of those individuals who look to him for help. Because he says they're coming to me not only to talk about their ailments, but to talk about what has happened to them on a daily basis. And so he realizes he can't not only just look at it from a professional standpoint, but when Evers comes and talks to him about it, he then goes and talks to other people who Evers talked about in Starkville. But they realize at that point that the people aren't ready because people are fearful that the NAACP is going to bring in a lot of this kind of negative backlash. That's not new for Starkville. That happened also in other parts of the state, particularly down in Biloxi in 1960, where you had Dr. Gilbert Mason, who was trying to integrate the beaches and trying to get people to understand, look, let's bring the NAACP in. They have the muscle, they have the money, they have also the strategies. But people said, look, if that happens, that's going to be a negative consequence to our jobs, but a negative consequence to our children. Let's just try to handle it on our own. Once those white individuals beat them black people on those beaches, Mason said they then came back to him and asked him one question: who can you bring in here to help solve this? And Mason said, I pointed him to the baddest dog I knew, the NAACP. So Medgar Evers comes back then and starts to organize because people realized they had gone as far as they're going to go. Now, when Evers gets in the late 50s, the people aren't yet ready. And so they begin to say, well, let's look at the law. You got laws that are here. 64, the Civil Rights Act. 65, the Voting Rights Act. Let's wait and see. And even Dr. Connor says, she said, let's wait and see what the white people are going to do. This is the law. They've got to go by it. But they didn't have to go by it. But by 1969, with the freedom of choice, that's when Dr. Connor says people realize then nothing's going to change here until we have that kind of organization and backing. That's when the NAACP then again revisited. And Dr. Connor is then able to say, well, remember we talked about the NAACP. Look at what they're doing down in other parts of the state. And then people say, okay, all right, it can't get any worse. All right, let's now look and see where the hell we can get it from. And then the NAACP establishes in 1969. Right? And things start to move. What I said earlier when I said the same kinds of things that are happening in Starkville comparatively are the same thing that's happening everywhere. African Americans understand what the problems are. The idea then becomes strategy. How do we work this to the best advantage so that my daughter and my son doesn't get killed at the end of the day? So when we start talking about civil rights struggle, it's more than just singing and laws and holding. It's more than that. People have been making life decisions. That's why I was so happy when I got an opportunity to come here. It is something when you have, I get mad when somebody cuts me in front of the bank in the line. Now imagine when your whole life when somebody can kill you for the simplest thing. You got to decide whether you're going to send your child to a school, knowing that when they kiss you in the morning, you may not see them that evening. Those are life decisions. And so when Evers comes and talks about the NAACP, people are thinking hard and long about that. Strategy. Starkville takes a while, people say, but it takes a while all over the place. It depends upon the level in which people finally place too much on their shoulders. And so that's what I meant by that. This becomes a very important discussion when we start talking about the importance of what's going on in Starkville. Because what's happening in Starkville, and when we talk about violence, physical violence versus psychological violence, it's all violence. It's all violence. It's something, and Dr. Connor talks about this. When you talk about economics, economic boycott, that had happened in Mount Bayou in 1952 with Dr. T.R.M. Howard who was leading that. But the thing about that is, and then I'll turn it over because, yeah. The thing about the economic boycott is when people look and they realize they don't see any black faces in any of the businesses, in the banks or wherever they are, they don't see black faces, that sends a powerful message to the children that you don't matter, you're invisible. And so parents then begin to say, how do we change that? Right? And that's where you start getting this kind of movement when you say it starts to jail. That's when it all kinds of come together. All right, I'll turn it over.
All right, I'm going to open this up to the community. Anybody have a question for our panelists?
This is a question, I guess, primarily for Michael and Stephanie, but perhaps all of you. I wonder if you see a difference in both the movement and resistance in places where you had black majority populations like the Delta and places in other parts of the state where African Americans were a minority. I mean, is there a difference in the nature of the movement and a difference in the nature of the resistance?
Who wants to take that?
Definitely. The Delta has a more aggressive Citizens Council movement in terms of numbers and also in terms of strategy. One of the things a lot of us don't really understand about the Citizens Council is that when it first started, it started as a secret organization, and they ended up winning some publicity because of their some of the violence that they had perpetrated along the way, and they ended up sort of seizing that and turning themselves into a PR agency of sorts. But there is, in places like Jackson, resistance is more than the Citizens Council, and I think it's easy to look at the Citizens Council and tag them. But so many members of the Citizens Council were also members, excuse me, of the chambers of commerce in their cities. They're members of the state legislature. They're leaders and deacons in their churches. There is a religious resistance organization that exists that has a lot of the same members. And so in Jackson, I think you see a lot more institutional buy-in from different groups, both private and civic. In places like the Delta, it's a little less visible, but much more dangerous. So that would, I think we can attribute that to the Black majority.
I would agree with that too, because even in the Delta, when you have a majority, the ones who control everything are still visiting down the level of violence. And they do amp it up in many instances, because now you've got to set examples. And so all of that comes into play. When you start talking about, like you say, Jackson, when now it starts to become part of the legislature with the Sovereignty Commission, it becomes much more institutionalized on a much larger level, all right, so that it has a much larger reach. But it's all still the same, because not only are African Americans strategizing on how to get out and under the oppression, but whites are strategizing how to keep them under it as well. Right? And so it depends on where you are. In the Delta and some of these other rural places, in the real back alley places, you have individuals who are quick to shoot, quick to lynch, quick to ride into a community and burn houses down, because it's that level that they're operating on. Then you start getting the legislature where you have the Sovereignty Commission where they get money from the legislature. It becomes a much more wide-reaching thing, because now it's looking at how do we protect the state on this larger level, while we have underlings in the small level doing the same thing. So it's all levels. Everything is levels.
And also, I'll add, when we think about the institutional, the resistance tactics really being in the water unleashes, as respectable as they say they are, and they're trying to be, and they're trying to civilize resistance, it unleashes the more raw elements that are out in these rural communities. Not to say that the council is any better, their message is a little cleaner and it's nicer to hear, but when someone like Byron De La Beckwith hears that message, he's empowered to do what he does. And so the institutional framework is really important, but we have to also understand how that models behavior who are people, for people who are looking to act in violent ways anyway.
The problem we really have around here, during our times of meeting and whatever we done, everybody agreed with what was going on. But then once you leave, then we changed our minds. Now we had Miss Van Hamer. She was a lady that once we decided, it happened. I mean, I followed her around a lot of years, and we were speaking of this between the time of 1966 to 1969, we really done some work, field work, what we call voter restoration, what we call trying to norm our people to get them to understand that if you done what you should do, you wouldn't be in no more danger than if you just walk in the street. Because if we walked the street, we were picked on. If we marched, we were picked on. If we boycotted, we were picked on. So anything we done, it was that way. But anyway, we carried on. And today I wonder, what happened to our younger people? I mean, our race, the younger, I don't know, I won't say wiser, because they don't act wiser. But the younger, they don't really care what happens. And being honest, I must speak clearly. Young white people, they don't care. I mean, you don't have a threat, but we had threats. I mean, guys stand around and wait to see, catch you someplace that you shouldn't be. Now, we don't have that today. so we don't have an excuse. If we want to do, we can do.
Hi guys. I have a question for the panel. In regards to the 1960s, there's a civil rights movement, but now we have the Black Lives Matter movement with the younger people. Here at State, people, think it's a little better. There are black people here, but often the younger black people still experience that same type of racism. They call rice vertical Africa. We have social media where we see young white kids with guns everywhere. And so there's this young movement who wants to start this movement to make things better here because they've experienced a lot of subversive racism. What advice do you have for them from your own experiences with civil rights movements?
Back then we didn't have the cell phones with the cameras and all. You got it all in your hand. If you got a camera, you got a cell phone, you got it. Just record it. And Zach raised your hand. Oh, he ain't with the paper no more. But old Zach would have been happy to publish it. But he with the paper, he with Mississippi State. And that's what I think. Now, one of these professors up here might think something different.
That's an important thing with what you're bringing out. This question of what do we do? How do we get at the issues that we see today? And I have this conversation with young people all the time. What you have to do is, first of all, make sure that you're well versed in what the problems and issues are. It's going to be very hard for you to organize or to talk about or to really kind of see what those issues, the deep issues, if you're not quite sure of what all is happening. So first of all, you make sure of that. Second of all, you have to seek out people who are like-minded. You do that by having meetings, wherever you are. And young people do come together a lot. They come together and they talk about a lot of nonsense sometimes, but they're together. All right? And so you have to be the person who says, well, what do you think about this? How do you think this impacts where we are today? And when we start talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, again, it used social media, really to kind of propel things forward. But you have to, if you're talking about dealing with the issues, a lot of people today think that they're by themselves. They think that this kind of thing happened to me, but I don't think it's happened to anybody else. Once you start talking about, these are the problems I see, forums, workshops, utilize churches. There's a lot of organizations on college campuses. Start putting together those kinds of programs and start talking to the young people that you're seeing, explaining what those issues are, what concerns you. Once you start asking people, what problems do you see? What are the issues that you find problematic? How did that impact you? Then people start wondering then, okay, first of all, this person is interested in what's going on. Second of all, it's forcing me to really think deeply about what happens to me on a daily basis. Once you start doing that, you start talking to people and getting those like-minded individuals, then you can start putting together kind of strategies to kind of put out there the problems that you see. Now, once you do that, and I tell people this all the time, then you got to start leaning on the expertise of those who have went through this stuff before you did. Right. See, there's a disconnect between young people and the older generation, and that disconnect is catastrophic. So what young people have to really kind of get themselves together and then come to the conclusion that I've got these problems. But really when you start looking at these problems historically, you start to see they're similar in the same things that people have gone through before. All right. So you ask a powerful question in terms of how do we deal with that today? Those are some of the things I think will put you on the path to where you won't feel so isolated. Because when you feel isolated, then you start feeling overwhelmed. Once you start feeling overwhelmed, you start finding something else that you feel is gonna ease that problem you got. And whether that's television, which I hate TV, or whatever it is. What you have to do is keep in your forehead that I was born at this particular place at this particular time for a reason. And when I close my eyes for the last time, I've got to know that I did everything I could to make this world better for me while I was here and those who were around me, but more importantly for those who were coming after me. That's what the movement was about. Everybody who sacrificed in the movement figured they wasn't going to see those end results. But it was for you, so you'd see them. Right? So those are the things that I would see in terms of that. And keep asking those important questions, because once you ask them, you can't help but find answers. That's the human way.
Okay. Go ahead.
I just want to make an announcement that Mississippi State has a vibrant African American Studies program. We offer courses in a variety of subjects: history, civil rights, law, and the like. You're welcome to join us. Encourage others, to join us, to attend our programs. It's a wonderful opportunity to engage these kinds of conversations.
There's quite a bit of comment about the school desegregation. What about the hospital in Starkville with Hill Burton requiring integration of the hospital? How did that work out?
I remember Miss Seth was, Miss Jeanette Seth was one of the nurses up there. We should have some older members. Chief Johnson, you was there. Talk to us. Can you remember?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit, I guess. I was back there in the early 70s involved with the hospital. I became employed as an EMT and went through some struggles, but one thing with me, I always believed that if someone else could do something, I could do it myself too. And that was something that way I was raised. But there at the hospital, there was some struggles. But back then too, they had OCH, and I guess due to O.C. Kelly, we didn't have, from my viewpoint, many racial disputes. We came together as a family. We did a lot of things together, no matter black or white. We had a lot of entertainment, things that we did outside the hospital. We go down Highway 25 and we used to camp out at night down at, can't think of the lake place down there, but we drank together. I don't do that anymore, but those things were good back then. But you do always, in any institution, you have some disputes. And I was the first black director of OCH back in the 70s of the ambulance service. But after that, I was involved in fire service, and that's another institution, if I may say, that was a great struggle for me, which I've already talked about in an interview, some things that I went through. But even at that, with the young lady too, the answer, it's a lot of things that went. You have to do some things individually. If you know what is wrong and you speak out, and I always was taught, do it in a respectful way. And there's a lot of things changed through the fire service because I spoke in a respectful way. There's a lot of things that were said back then on the radios using N-words, but I went through the proper process and it stopped. So it's a struggle, but I think through all the struggle, you have to be determined that no matter what happened to you, like the gentleman said, you'll plant a seed for someone else. And I think that's something that we always think of, and I think it always will be a struggle as long as we live. As human beings, there always will be a struggle, but we have to come to terms that we can make a difference. And just one person can make a difference And I hit myself, I think I made a difference in fire service. Started off on the bottom, but went all the way up to become a fire chief. But it's the way you carry yourself.
We don't have a lot of interviews with people about hospital integration, but there are some materials in the John C. Stennis collection at the MSU libraries about hospital integration.
All right, we have time for about one more question. So does anybody else have a pressing period?
It's not really a question. It's just a comment about hospital integration. At my church, we had a benefit for Dr. Connor, where we took the money raised and bought one of Dr. Maserati's books. But every library in the county, some of them more than one, but every library in Occoquan County now has a book of Dr. Connor in its. But anyway, at the benefit program, Dr. Parvin shared that in Dr. Connor's practice in those early years, he was not allowed to see his patients at the hospital. And they had a patient there who was gravely ill, and the other doctors were just afraid to wait on this patient. And I don't remember the story. I have it on DVD, and I'll give it to you all if you want. But Dr. Parvin shared that somehow Dr. Connor learned about this patient and asked to care for it, and he did, and the person survived. And after that, the way was paved for him to see additional people at the hospital. That's how he got in the hospital.
One more question.
I have a question. Can I ask one? I can ask one? Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So it seems like in the last 2 decades there's been great change to curriculum, not just in the South, but all across the United States, that has worked to incorporate more stories in the larger narrative about African Americans and the Civil Rights Movement. And my question is, do you think that this change in the curriculum has affected the younger generation of African Americans, and perhaps if it's contributed to a different thinking among their community?
Well, from where I sit, I haven't seen a great change. I can remember there was when I came through public schools, there was a text, history, Mississippi history text written by Bettersworth, which was, to be kind, a one-sided version of Mississippi history that, didn't mention Native Americans, African Americans. And Silas and Lowen wrote another history book, but it never made it into the classrooms. And we're still dealing with textbooks that are not inclusive. And I think that's the crux of the problem, that as long as students are given this one-sided version of American and Mississippi history, and it even permeates in some cases the universities, that we won't see that kind of substantial change. To address the question earlier by the student here, I think it doesn't have to be an either-or, it can be a both-and, that there can be individual. See, the movement has evolved. It has not ended, some would say, and we are not in a post-racial society simply because we have a president, a black president, and look at everything he's having to deal with on a daily basis. When I teach African American literature, I teach multi-ethnic literature. And I always have to take pains to say most of my class is about 90% white, that it is not an indictment of you as an individual white person. When we discuss texts that have to do with, racism, there is institutionalized racism. It's in every institution in America, so that as long as you have institutionalized racism, no matter who the players are, there's still a certain group of people who are going to be disenfranchised, who are going to be mistreated. I've won 2 racial discrimination lawsuits. And this is why I want to say to this young lady, one up south and one down south, that an individual can effect change that will affect a whole group of people. Because each of those cases took 6 years. That was 12 years out of my life struggling. And I often tell students, they say, well, I don't want to be considered an affirmative action hire. Well, affirmative action law is on the book. But if you don't file an affirmative action case, then it's just sitting there. It's not going to work. So an individual can take a stand where one sees discrimination and racism, but you can also ally yourself with groups. Now, just recently, when I was at Toulouse as an undergraduate, I was an exchange student at Brown University. We just recently celebrated the 50th year of the Brown-Toulouse Partnership in Providence. There was a panel of veteran civil rights leaders who spoke. And they talked about how they went around, and knocked on doors, and that's how they gathered the momentum for students to get involved, because people were saying, oh, I don't see the young people involved now. And so someone made the suggestion, well, and this all predated Black Lives Matter. This was last, October of last year. And someone mentioned, well, young people today, even though they don't meet in a group and go around and knock on doors, they can use social media. And isn't that just what happened? I see that as an evolution of the kind of movement that we had in the 60s. And so one can gain momentum by aligning oneself with these organizations that, where they're always visionaries, who, people who are on the cutting edge, who do more than watch TV news. You have to listen to a number of news outlets, read a number of various news sources, so that you can see through. We even have people who are redefining terms. What a whistleblower is. Okay, is a whistleblower a person who puts at risk all the news that have, everything the United States has done, or is it someone who truly tells what is being done wrong in a company? Well, if you don't read well, if you don't read widely, you can be misled by even what the movement is, and that we are a post-racial society. Okay, but both and. That one can take individual stands, one can ally oneself with groups to organize and move as an organization.
Starkville Civil County just consolidated schools. So I want to just invite you, just go out to East Elementary and see how many white kids you see. And then go to West Elementary and see how many white kids you see. And you be the judge. Nothing wrong with the city schools.
Can you join me in thanking this esteemed panel?